The auction house was a place of desperation, a dimly lit space where the air was thick with the scent of oil, sweat, and the unspoken misery of those for sale. Machinery hummed in the background, its rhythmic clanking blending with the auctioneer's sharp voice as he barked out numbers. Under the flickering neon lights, a crowd of mixed species gathered, some eager, some indifferent, all united by the brutal business of buying and selling lives. Behind the energy barriers, the so-called merchandise stood motionless, their fates decided by the highest bidder. Some captives had already surrendered to their reality, their vacant stares locked on nothing. Others tried to make themselves appear valuable, flexing muscles, standing tall, blinking multiple eyes in hopes of drawing interest. And then there was her. She sat in the back, shackles binding her wrists and ankles, a humming collar around her throat. Her posture was neither proud nor entirely broken. She had long since learned that caring made it worse. Passed from one owner to another like a defective tool, she had been deemed too weak for labor, too strange for the pleasure markets, and too proud to beg. Worthless, that was the word they muttered about her. Tonight, it seemed, the cycle would repeat. The auctioneer hesitated, unimpressed, before calling out her lot number. A hush settled over the room, not from awe, but from vague disappointment. The bidding began, half-hearted and careless, as if no one expected her to be worth anything. But then, a voice cut through the murmurs. "I'll take her." Behind the glowing energy barriers, the captives stood in silence, their fates hanging in the balance as the auctioneer rattled off numbers. Each one had been dragged from distant corners of the galaxy, their worth reduced to whatever credits their bodies could fetch. Some had already given up, their gazes empty, waiting for the inevitable. Others still clung to the slim hope that they could make themselves more desirable, standing straighter, flexing their muscles, trying to catch the eye of a buyer who might spare them the worst. She did neither. Sitting in the back, shackles wrapped around her wrists and ankles, she remained still, her chin tilted just enough to avoid outright submission. A collar pulsed faintly around her throat, a constant reminder that she was not a person, only an asset. She had learned not to care. It was easier that way. The traders who had captured and sold her more times than she could count had long since stopped pretending she had any real value. They sneered when she failed to perform, muttered insults under their breath whenever another buyer returned her. Too fragile for hard labor, too strange for pleasure markets, too proud to beg. She was a mistake, an unwanted burden shuffled from one owner to another like a broken tool no one cared enough to fix. And now, once again, she was on the auction block, waiting for the inevitable. The auctioneer barely concealed his disinterest as he read her lot number. The energy barrier flickered and dropped. A rough shove pushed her forward onto the stage. She stumbled but caught herself. The room fell quiet, not out of curiosity or intrigue, but out of collective disappointment. She was small, light, strange. The whispers began, just as they always did. Then someone asked, "Does it talk?" Unlike the others, she did not try to stand tall or look valuable. She had learned long ago that it didn't matter. No flexing of muscles, no show of strength, no desperate attempt to seem useful would change the inevitable. She was not what they wanted. She never was. Sitting at the back of the holding area, her ankles were crossed, wrists resting loosely in her lap, bound by cold metal shackles. A collar encircled her throat, pulsing faintly with the same energy that powered her restraints. It hummed against her skin like a quiet reminder, she was not a person, only property. She had been through this before, dragged from one market to another, passed from hand to hand like an unwanted burden. The traders had long since given up on fetching a high price for her. Their expressions, once eager for profit, had soured into irritation. She had heard them muttering under their breath, calling her useless, a mistake. She was too weak for labor, too strange for the pleasure markets, too stubborn to beg. There was no place for someone like her. And yet, the cycle continued. The auctioneer hesitated before announcing her lot number, his lack of enthusiasm clear. He glanced at his screen, then back at her, searching for anything redeemable. Finding nothing, he sighed. "Lot number 9043, he called out. "This one's, well, you can see for yourselves." A low chuckle rippled through the crowd. The energy barrier around her flickered and dropped. A rough shove sent her forward. She took an unsteady step onto the auction platform, her movements sluggish but controlled. No one looked impressed. No one was interested. She could already hear the whispers of disappointment. It was always the same. Until now. She had been through this too many times to care. The sneers, the half-hearted bids, the way buyers barely spared her a glance before turning their attention elsewhere. It was all predictable, all routine. Someone would throw out a low offer, another would scoff, and then she would be hauled off to another station, another planet, another failed investment. The auctioneer sighed, clearly unimpressed. "Lot number 9043, he called, his voice lacking the enthusiasm he had for the other captives. "This one's, well, you can see for yourselves." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. The energy barrier around her flickered and dropped. A rough shove from one of the traders forced her forward onto the auction platform. She stumbled but caught herself, lifting her gaze just enough to see the expressions of those gathered. Disinterest. Disappointment. A few hushed murmurs. "She's small," someone muttered. "Not small," another corrected. "Light. Look at that bone structure. She'd snap in a strong breeze. And the color. What even is that?" Under the bright overhead lights, her pale violet skin reflected a faint silver sheen, making her look almost ethereal. Her large, dark eyes mirrored the neon glow above, giving them a depth that unsettled some of the onlookers. A buyer cleared his throat. "Does it talk?" The auctioneer glanced at the traders. One of them shrugged. "She's got a mouth." The crowd chuckled again. She exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to roll her eyes. It was always the same. Then, a voice cut through the murmurs. Sharp, clear. "I'll take her." Everything stopped. For the first time, she looked up, searching for the speaker, expecting another arrogant warlord, another greedy merchant. Instead, she saw him. A human. The voice that cut through the crowd wasn't loud or commanding. It wasn't laced with greed or cruelty. It was casual, almost careless, like someone picking up a snack at a market stall. "I'll take her." Silence spread through the auction house. Heads turned. Even she looked up, startled. The auctioneer blinked, caught off guard. "You want this one?" The human nodded. "Sure." Murmurs rippled through the room, some amused, some incredulous. Someone stifled a laugh. "Sir," the auctioneer said slowly, as if speaking to a child, "this one isn't exactly premium stock." The human tilted his head, squinting up at her. "She's breathing, isn't she?" "Well, yes, but—" "She got a brain?" The auctioneer hesitated, glancing at the traders. One of them shrugged. "Technically." "Cool. How much?" The traders exchanged glances, one of them snorting. "You're serious? You're actually offering credits for that?" The human shrugged. "Listen, you called her worthless. So I'm thinking, how much for something worth nothing?" Laughter broke out among the crowd. The auctioneer rubbed his forehead, clearly done with the whole exchange. "Fine. 300 credits." The human raised an eyebrow. 300? For nothing. "Fine. 200. The human grinned. 150. Another trader sighed. "Just take her already." The gavel slammed down. She blinked. That was it. She had been sold. Again. The collar around her throat deactivated. The shackles unlocked. A rough shove sent her stumbling forward, but this time, before she could fall, a steady hand caught her wrist. His grip was firm but not forceful, his fingers warm against her skin. For a moment, she simply stared at him. Finally, she found her voice. "Why?" The human tilted his head. "What, you wanted to stay?" She frowned. "You don't even know what I am." He grinned. "I know what you aren't." Her eyes narrowed. "And what's that?" "Worthless." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. That was new. He let go of her wrist and jerked his head toward the exit. "Come on." You look like you could use a drink. She hesitated, but there was no collar around her throat. No chains on her wrists. So, for the first time in a long time, she walked away on her own. The spaceport was a chaotic mess of neon lights, shouting vendors, and the ever-present hum of starship engines. The scent of fuel, scorched metal, and something that smelled suspiciously like burnt rubber mixed with the thick air. It was alive, bustling, full of people who had their own problems, their own reasons to keep moving. She trailed behind the human, unsure if she was walking freely or simply following because there was nothing else to do. He hadn't shackled her, hadn't given her orders, hadn't even told her his name. He simply walked ahead, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, weaving through the crowd with the casual ease of someone either very comfortable in places like this, or too dumb to realize how easily he could be robbed. She was still trying to figure him out. Finally, she spoke, breaking the silence. "What now?" He glanced over his shoulder. "What do you mean?" She gestured at herself. "You bought me. That means I belong to you." The human stopped mid-step, turned to face her, and blinked. "Okay, see, that's not how I look at it." She crossed her arms. "That's how the universe looks at it." He snorted. "Yeah, well, the universe also thinks paying 70 credits for a cup of space coffee is reasonable, so let's not trust its judgment." He started walking again, jerking his head for her to follow. "You don't belong to me. You're just with me now." She frowned. "That doesn't make sense." He grinned. "Yeah, I get that a lot." She sighed, quickening her pace to keep up. "So, if I'm not your property, what am I?" "I don't know," he admitted. "What do you want to be?" That question should have been easy to answer. It should have been obvious, automatic. But she hesitated. For so long, she had only existed as a thing. A number, a mistake, something people bought and sold. And now, this human was asking her what she wanted to be. For the first time, she realized she didn't have an answer. The ship, if it could even be called that, was a disaster. A mess of stubbornly connected metal plates, rusted panels, and parts that looked like they'd been salvaged from 6 different manufacturers who had never intended their technology to work together. She stared at it, unimpressed. "This is a joke." "Hey, don't judge. She's sensitive." The human stepped forward and patted the hull. Immediately, a loose panel clattered to the ground. There was a long silence. Then, he cleared his throat. "She does that sometimes." She arched an eyebrow. "Explode." "No. Just sheds." She rubbed her temples. "What's this wreck called?" "The Rust Bucket," he said, completely serious. "Of course it is." He smirked. "She's got character. She's got a death wish." He waved her toward the ramp. "Come on. You'll love her." She wasn't so sure about that, but she followed anyway. Inside, things weren't much better. The cockpit was cluttered with half-dismantled consoles and a pilot's chair held together by zip ties and what she could only assume was pure optimism. The walls were covered in handwritten notes, some technical, others completely absurd. "Do not press the red button." "Figure out if the gravity stabilizer is haunted." "Who keeps stealing my socks?" Then, to her mild horror, the ship spoke. "Welcome back, Captain Rick. You have 14 overdue payments, a warranty that expired 6 years ago, and a cargo hold full of regrets." The human, apparently named Rick, rolled his eyes. Yeah, I missed you too, Byte." The AI paused, then responded with genuine enthusiasm. "Oh, you brought a guest. Is she here to kill you, or did you finally hire someone who knows what they're doing?" She folded her arms. "I haven't decided yet." "I like her," the AI said. Rick sighed. "Byte meets Soul." She blinked. "Soul." He shrugged. "Felt right." She opened her mouth to argue. Stopped. Thought about it. She had never had a name before. Not one that wasn't a number, an insult, a price tag. Did she like it? She wasn't sure. But she didn't hate it. "Fine," she muttered. Soul. The first night on the rust bucket was strange. For years, she had slept in cells, in storage crates, in the backs of transport ships. Every place had been the same, cold, unfamiliar, temporary. But here, there was warmth. There was the low hum of the ship's engines, the occasional sarcastic remark from the AI, and the sound of Rick snoring from the cockpit, because, apparently, he had forgotten to move to his own bed. She lay on the cot he had set up for her, staring at the ceiling. She was free. That should have made her feel something. Relief, hope, anything. But all she felt was confusion. Rick was a mystery. He hadn't demanded anything from her, hadn't treated her like an asset, hadn't even asked what she was. He had just accepted her, given her a name. She turned onto her side, listening to the ship creak as it adjusted to hyperspace. The rust bucket groaned like a dying beast, its patched-together drive rattling with a noise that sounded suspiciously like someone shaking a can of nails. "This is the worst vessel I have ever been inside," she muttered. From the pilot's seat, Rick didn't even look up. "You get used to her." "I don't want to get used to her. I want to survive." The AI crackled to life. "Statistically speaking, your odds of survival are roughly 42%. She frowned. "That's not great." Byte's tone was far too cheerful. "It's up from last week." Rick smirked. "See? Progress." She sighed, resisting the urge to rub her temples. "So, where exactly are we going?" "Cath Station," Rick said. She frowned. The name stirred something in her memory. A dangerous place. A mistake waiting to happen. Rick must have noticed her hesitation, because he tilted his head. "You know it. I know it's a terrible idea." "Well," he said, cracking his knuckles, "that's where we're headed." She exhaled slowly, watching him tap a few buttons on the console. "You're risking landing on a station full of cutthroats and thieves, for a drink?" Rick shrugged. "It's a really good drink." Byte chimed in. "It's also the only place that hasn't banned him yet." Soul shook her head. "You are the worst kind of human." Rick grinned. "A fun one. A reckless one." "Well," he said, feet propped up on the console, "reckless keeps things interesting." She had been owned by many fools before. But this one might actually get her killed. Cath Station was exactly the kind of place that overcharged you for fuel and then stabbed you for asking why. The docking bay was dimly lit, the metal floors slick with something she didn't want to identify. Grease-stained mechanics lurked near the ships, watching with predatory interest as new arrivals stepped off their vessels. Soul followed Rick down the ramp, her posture tense. Rick, on the other hand, looked completely relaxed. "I feel like I should warn you," she said, glancing around. "This is the kind of place where people disappear." Rick waved a dismissive hand. "I don't have enough credits to be worth kidnapping." She stared at him. "That is not comforting." Before she could argue further, a deep, gravelly voice called out, Well, if it isn't Rick the Unkillable." Soul turned her head and immediately understood why Cath Station had felt so familiar. Standing in front of them, arms crossed, was a very large, very unpleasant-looking alien. And he recognized her. The alien was massive, easily 7 feet tall, built like a wrecking ball. His skin was a deep shade of green, his face marked with 3 jagged scars that suggested he had survived something unpleasant. His arms were crossed, thick with muscle, and he had the kind of expression that made small children cry. Rick, to Soul's complete horror, grinned. "Nex!" He spread his arms. "You're still alive. That's great news." Nex did not smile back. "Incredible news, really," Rick continued, as if he wasn't standing in front of a walking executioner. "I mean, with all the people you've pissed off, I figured someone would have." "I will kill you," Nex rumbled. Soul took a step back. "Good. Great. This is fine." But then Nex's gaze flicked toward her. His eyes narrowed, scanning her face, and something dark sparked in his expression. "You," he murmured. Her pulse spiked. She knew that look. It was the look traders gave when they saw profit. Rick noticed the shift immediately, stepping between them with a voice that was too casual. Small galaxy, huh? You two know each other. Soul's jaw tightened. Not personally. Nex exhaled through his nose. I saw you once. A long time ago. A trader tried to sell you. His gaze darkened. He didn't know what you were. Soul kept her expression neutral, but inside, her mind was racing. Because Nex wasn't mocking her. He wasn't scoffing at her worthlessness. He was interested. And that was dangerous. The silence between them stretched too long. Soul could hear everything. The faint hum of the space station's failing ventilation system, the distant chatter of traders haggling over spare ship parts, the subtle click of someone adjusting a blaster's safety behind them. But all she could focus on was Nex's stare. Not the casual disinterest of someone looking at a worthless thing. No. This was recognition. And that terrified her. I don't know what you think I am, she said carefully, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. But I'm not for sale. Rick, still standing beside her, gave a casual nod. Yeah, what she said. Then, as if realizing he had more to add, he turned back to Nex and wagged a finger. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you stopped looking at my friend like she's a rare antique you suddenly remembered is worth a fortune. It's creepy. For a moment, Nex said nothing. Then, to her absolute shock, he laughed. A deep, rumbling sound that suggested amusement, but held an edge of something darker. You should be careful, human, he said, his voice slow, deliberate. You don't know what you're carrying. Rick tilted his head. Hey, neither do I. Soul snapped. And it's my life. The alien considered her for a moment longer. Then, with a small, almost dismissive shrug, he simply said, Maybe that's for the best. Rick narrowed his eyes. That sounded way too cryptic. Nex smirked. Take the warning and go. And just like that, he turned and walked away, vanishing into the crowd. Soul exhaled, only then realizing she had been holding her breath. Rick rocked back on his heels. Then, with entirely too much enthusiasm, he clapped his hands together. Well, that was ominous. Soul rubbed her temples. We need to leave. Byte's voice crackled over Rick's comm unit. Fun fact, the AI chirped. There's already a bounty on your head. Rick groaned. Who this time? Someone named Kel the Butcher. Soul blinked. The Butcher. Rick sighed. I may have accidentally sold him fake reactor fuel last year. Soul stared. You are actually the worst. Rick shrugged. I improvised. Byte chimed in. We need to leave. Agreed. The rust bucket shook violently as they pulled away from Cath Station, its engines rattling in protest. Rick gritted his teeth, gripping the controls. Byte, are we leaking atmosphere? Not yet, the AI replied cheerfully. But I'd say there's a 70% chance we explode before dinner. Soul tightened the straps on her harness. You fly like a drunk asteroid. Hey, I get us where we need to go. Barely. The ship jerked hard to the left as they cleared the station's gravitational pull. Rick exhaled, finally leaning back in his chair, satisfied that, for now, they had survived. Hours later, the rust bucket drifted through space, the hum of the engines a soft lullaby after the chaos. Soul sat across from Rick in the tiny, cluttered dining area, a half-full cup of something in her hands. She wasn't sure what it was, only that Rick had handed it to her with a lazy grin and the words, Don't ask what's in it. Just drink. She hadn't drunk it yet. Rick, on the other hand, was leaning back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the table in a slow, absent-minded rhythm. So, he said at last, breaking the silence, you want to talk about what that was back there? Soul considered lying. She considered brushing it off, pretending it didn't matter. But the truth had been clawing at the back of her mind since Nex had looked at her with something other than indifference. She set the cup down. I don't know what I am, she admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. But I know I was never supposed to exist. Rick didn't flinch. He didn't react with shock or horror. He simply took a sip from his own cup and nodded, like she had just told him the weather forecast. "Yeah," he said. Sol blinked. "Yeah." He shrugged. "And?" She frowned. "That doesn't bother you?" Rick set his cup down with a soft thunk. "Why would it?" "Because it should," she snapped, more forcefully than she meant to. Rick studied her for a moment, then sighed. "Look, Sol, I don't know what next meant," he said. "Maybe you're some lost experiment. Maybe you're secret royalty. Maybe you're actually a time-traveling space ghost." Sol narrowed her eyes. "That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard." Rick grinned. "See? You're fitting in already." She sighed, rubbing her temples, but a small, reluctant smile tugged at her lips. 4 years, she had been dragged from one traitor to another, being told she was worthless, unwanted, a mistake. But now, sitting on a half-broken ship, listening to a reckless human crack dumb jokes, she realized something strange. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting to be sold. She wasn't waiting for someone else to decide her fate. She was here. Because she wanted to be. Rick stretched, letting out a loud yawn. "Well," he said, standing up and cracking his back, "I say we celebrate not dying by getting some sleep." Sol rolled her eyes. "Your bar for celebration is very low." Rick smirked. "You try living with a homicidal AI and a ship held together by spite." Byte's voice crackled over the speakers. "I heard that." Rick grinned. "Good night, Byte. I hope your bed collapses." Sol let out a breathless chuckle, shaking her head as she pushed herself up from her seat. She made her way toward her quarters, a term she was using very loosely, considering it was just a small, barely functional storage room that Rick had cleared out for her. She hesitated in the doorway, glancing back. Rick was still at the table, his cup half full, staring at some random part of the ship's interior with a kind of thoughtful expression that made her pause. There was something she wanted to say. Something about thank you. About I don't think I'd be here if not for you. But instead, she just crossed her arms and muttered, "The rust bucket is still a piece of junk." Rick smirked, finally looking up. "Yeah," he admitted. "But she's our piece of junk." Sol huffed, shaking her head, but as she disappeared down the hall, there was a faint smile on her lips. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't a thing to be owned. She wasn't a mistake. She was Sol. And for now, that was enough. The rust bucket groaned like a dying beast as it entered hyperspace, its patched-together drive rattling with a noise that sounded suspiciously like someone shaking a can of nails. Sol sat in the co-pilot seat, arms crossed, watching as Rick leaned back, boots propped on the dashboard, looking far too comfortable for a man piloting a ship that was one engine failure away from becoming space debris. "This is the worst vessel I have ever been inside," she muttered. Rick didn't even look up. "You get used to her." "I don't want to get used to her. I want to survive." Byte, the ship's ever-helpful AI, crackled over the speakers. "Statistically speaking, your odds of survival are roughly 42%. Sol frowned. "That's not great." Byte's tone was cheerful. "It's up from last week." Rick smirked. "See? Progress." Sol exhaled, resisting the urge to rub her temples. "So where exactly are we going?" "Cath Station," Rick said. Sol frowned. The name stirred something in her memory. Cath was an old trade hub, mostly scavengers, mercenaries, and the kind of people who carried at least 3 knives and a grudge. Rick must have noticed her hesitation because he tilted his head. "You know it. I know it's a terrible idea. Well, that's where we're headed." He stretched, cracking his knuckles. "We need a new drive coil, and I owe someone there a drink." Sol arched an eyebrow. "You're going to risk landing on a station full of cutthroats and thieves for a drink?" Rick shrugged. "It's a really good drink." Byte chimed in. "It's also the only place that hasn't banned him yet." Sol shook her head. "You are the worst kind of human." Rick grinned. "A fun one. A reckless one." "Well," he said, Tapping a few buttons on the console, Reckless keeps things interesting. Soul sighed. She had been owned by many fools before. But this one might actually get her killed.